Hello, and welcome to the third and final episode of Thinking Big for Small and Mid-Sized Biotechs, the podcast that features seasoned experts sharing strategies they've used to help small and mid-sized companies get innovative treatments to the people who need them. If you're joining us for the first time, I encourage you to go back and listen to the first two installments of this podcast. In episode 1, we spoke with Mary Beth Adams, a regulatory strategy specialist, about how defining a regulatory roadmap can save you time and money. In episode 2, we discussed the challenges and opportunities of multinational clinical trials with Pavle Vukovic, a rheumatologist turned clinical researcher who is now the Chief Scientific Officer for Allucent. Today, we are talking about how small and mid-sized companies can operationalize cell and gene therapy trials. Joining us is Desmond Cabrera, Allucent's global lead for cell and gene therapy. Desmond has more than 15 years' experience in clinical research and is well-versed in the unique challenges of bringing cutting-edge biologic therapies to market. Desmond is also a former college football player. Welcome, Desmond.
Hey, Jennifer. Thank you. Glad to be here today.
Tell us a little bit first how and why you got involved in cell and gene therapy.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been, as noted, in the industry for about 15 years, but all the way back from college, I was a biology major. So I've always had an affinity for the sciences. As I was growing in my career, I was working on some oncology trials at one of my former roles. And I started reading, how the industry was moving and how therapies were changing into cell and gene. And for me, it's always been on the cusp of almost some science fiction, the way that we're using our bodies to actually beat degenerative diseases and cancers and things of that nature. So it was a wild ride, and I really was interested in it from a affinity perspective and just continued to build my career into it.
It's that opportunity to be really on the edge, on the cusp, you said, of things that not that long ago seemed like fantasy, science fiction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been a wild ride for the industry, and it's important to continue to keep up with it too, because what was probably cutting edge even 5 years ago now is we're in the next phase, the next stages of it. So it's a great move towards ultimately curing diseases for patients.
Let's talk about that part, about how quickly things are changing, because for any company, staying up to date with what's happening and how the regulatory environment is changing is a challenge. Staying on top of the emerging science and best practices and regulatory guidance. How do you stay on top of all of that? And how can a small and mid-sized company stay on top of that?
So I kind of will break that up into two different parts. The first part will be the personal side of what I try to do. This last fall semester, actually, I had taken a couple courses through Harvard's continuing education program from their medical school. And the two classes that I took was cancer genomics and then immuno-oncology. And essentially they're bring you up to speed on the science, that patient interactions, case studies. It was really interactive, and I highly recommend it for individuals that are trying to keep up with the industry and keep up with the science. So from a personal standpoint, I think you have to be smart about staying in the loop with what's changing in the educational role and in the medical field. Mm-hmm. But for our clients, it's important for companies like Allucent and myself to ensure that we have the right subject matter experts in-house and make sure that we bring in a level of experience where each particular phase of their trial, we have someone who is relevant and keeping up to it, in their space. And that's what we try to do. And for me in operations, it's about understanding how technology might be changing, how, like you noted, regulatory is changing in Europe right now. There's a big push to ECTR, which is a completely different submission process where there's a part 1 and a part 2, and I would be lying if I knew exactly how it works. But we have to be aware that the changes which are better for the patients and for the countries that are associated, that also brings a level of knowledge that you need to have and experience. And that's what we really try to make sure our staff and teams have, so that way we can communicate that with our clients.
It is pretty impossible for any one individual to keep up with all of that. And if you are a smaller or mid-sized company, by definition, most of your resources and time are likely going towards the science and improving your product. I can see how partnering with other people that have more expertise is helpful, because in the time it would take to try and catch up with the science or the regulatory, I mean, who knew that there was something different going on in Europe as we're speaking?
Right. No, exactly. And I think that's exactly the type of clients that we see and clients we want to help, right? It's the matter of there's probably sometimes 3 to 4 stakeholders currently at the company. They're just starting into their preclinical trials, or they're just getting through their preclinical and they're starting to look at the FDA, right? And that's the big component of it. And it's impossible for me to know every aspect of the FDA submissions. But then I have colleagues who are ex-FDA who come in at the really early stages where they're talking to the sponsors about what the protocol looks like, what their program looks like, their co-clinical development, to kind of understand it. And then they give really good saged advice. I mean, that's the best way I can explain it, where, I've been sitting in a room and watching these minds go back and forth about the regulatory to the FDA. And it's really interesting on the perspective from what the FDA might be looking at versus what a sponsor might initially be generating. But once you get through that part, and I'm sitting in the room there from an operational standpoint, we're starting to kind of connect the dots to, okay, what does this look like from a timeline? What does this complexity look like when we want to send our monitors out to sites? Or what does it look like for a patient? Does a patient come in? Are they going to be engaged in this particular trial? In cell and gene therapy, patients, they're getting information from new media. So, what's interesting is because it's so cutting edge, as magazines and normal New York Times or Wall Street Journal sectors pick up on the stories, the general public's getting a really good idea of what that looks like. And they're interested in it because when you're through, if we're talking about oncology specifically, if you're through certain stages of cancer and there may not be an alternative, and then someone comes to you and they say, there's a clinical trial, and in this clinical trial, we're going to use your cells and we're going to infuse those cells back, but it's going to teach your body how to fight that cancer. There's no more chemo. There's no more radiation. It's enticing for a patient. So we have to be sure that when the protocols are developed, although from a safety and efficacy standpoint, it also is something that a patient can engage in and be able to work for treatment, and work for a cure.
Yeah. As you talk about sage advice and these people, and I'm picturing them gathering around a table and planning and coming up with this game plan. And then simultaneously, I'm thinking about your past history as a football player, and I'm seeing some parallels here, right? I mean, in a football team, you have different players, different positions. You have lots of different coaches who are in charge of different things. Can you help us draw some parallels between preparing for success in a football game and preparing for cell and gene clinical trials? I think there are some parallels.
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate the call out to my old days of being an athlete. It's a couple years past being an athlete, but I still try to stay incorporated into it. So really, it's a great analogy. Football is probably the most ultimate team game. And I'm talking about American football for my colleagues outside of the US. The other football probably has some similar analogies, but I'll use the American football for you. In a team game of football, all your coaches are essentially what I would consider your subject matter experts. There are your defensive backs, which are worried about the pass, the coaches that are worrying about the passing. And then there's other coaches that are worried about the run. And much like a cell and gene trial, it works out the same. As noted, I have colleagues that are specialized in the FDA submission. I have other colleagues that are specialized in protocol generation. And then there's myself, where I'm looking at it from post-IND, when we get the approval from the FDA. What does that look like from a startup perspective? Do we have the right sites? Do we have the right number of patients that are going to meet the cohort, things of that nature. And then all the way through database lock, and really making sure that the teams under me, from, I would say, the quarterback. So as being the quarterback of the particular team, you want to make sure you're lined up correctly. And I'm not going to claim that I'm the Tom Brady of the team, but I am an integral cog to the team. And I think ultimately, if you and your teammates work at it from that perspective, it's a huge amount of success that our sponsors appreciate, because what they're really doing is they're organizing that team, right? They're looking at all the different cities and they're saying, you know what, we really want to go with Allucent or whatever the case might be, because they bring the best team for the approach they're looking for.
And just like in football, or frankly, other team sports, it's not all just football. It helps when you do the planning for defense, you do the planning for unexpected things. If you put in that effort on the forefront, you're more likely to be successful and surmount those challenges when they occur.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a good game plan is paramount to any type of level of success. And that starts from, when you're looking at your clinical development pipeline as a sponsor, and then you pick your partner that you want to move forward, that you have the right timelines and you have the right approach. Because as noted earlier, for Europe, for example, there's a new process and you have to account for that timing. And then you want to line that up to maybe there's funding that you're looking at. I know JP Morgan sometimes sits in January and companies want to, show data, show progress. So all of those things, you really have to put in front of you. And it's not just about what happens next month. It's about what does the next 18 months look like? And it's really important for the CRO or partners of choice to be in those conversations, because ultimately when you look at milestones, on paper, it's just a date. But what does that date really signify for a company? Well, that maybe that first patient in, that signifies data that they want to bring into potentially some additional funding to expand their trial, to expand the reach to patients. And ultimately, that's what it's about. It's about how do we get the therapies to the patients faster with safety and efficacy in hand.
So what I hear you saying is that it's really important to be considering both your scientific goals and your business goals kind of simultaneously, that you know both of those pieces and can build a plan that meets the endpoints and needs of both of those sides.
Absolutely. That's absolutely how I go about it when I have these conversations with sponsors. Usually my first question is, what is an important corporate goal for you by the end of year? And that single question can lead to varied conversations. But at the end of the day, it's really that transparency and that collaboration to get them to their goal, which eventually will get that medication, that therapy to a patient.
Desmond, let's talk about needing to balance the desire to move fast, because everybody wants to get their product, their solutions to patients as quickly as possible, because these are real lives that are being impacted. And yet there's a need to sort of take some time to develop a realistic plan. How do you balance those two needs?
I think the easiest approach or the fastest way that you get to a solution is always to have that open dialogue initially, right? I think if you're able to really kind of dissect what each time point looks like and what we need to drive underneath that time point, it is basic in some regards, project management 101. Now, you do need effective leadership to any of those deliverables. And I think that kind of goes back to that team environment. No one person is going to be able to solve every problem. You have to lean on your subject matter experts. You have to lean on, people within the company or within the sponsor to have those sometimes awkward conversations of, this looks like this may not make the timeline. Here's why, but here are the solutions. Or there's the really nice conversations to say, okay, I understand what you're trying to deliver. We can make this work, and this is how we're going to do it. So for me, it's always been about the conversation and the dialect, not dialect, the dialect that goes back and forth, to make sure that you're both on the same page.
It's a constant conversation. And I imagine sometimes it has to evolve due to unforeseen factors or due to a regulatory update, for instance.
Exactly. In cell and gene therapy, there was... Right now, the industry is really, I think if you look at the overall stats, it's primarily oncology. I mean, that's kind of where it is. And the space is starting to expand outside of oncology. But really, in the oncology space, there's a lot going on. I mean, we all know there's about 7 medications or therapies that are currently approved, but they're all considered autologous. And what autologous is oneself, basically your cells, genetically modified, infused back for therapies. And this is in the hematologic oncology, hematologic cancers. The other side of this is the allo. And the allo are basically the easiest ways to consider this would be off the shelf. So it's not dependent on the one patient who has the cancer to come in and then genetically modify their body. It's about having a product of cells that are basically off the shelf from donors where they've already been genetically modified and that they can, be transferred, infused into the subjects for the potential treatment. And bringing those two things to light, when sponsors come in and they have a solid tumor project, well, right now in the solid tumors, we're still looking for overall breakthroughs. We're still looking for overall signals. So, you have to be smart on a strategy at first. Sometimes clients will come in and they'll want to look at a very specific solid tumor, while others might want to do a basket approach where they're looking for various tumors, which I think is more what makes more sense because you're trying to find that signal at the beginning stages. But where I have to help them with is when they're looking at a basket trial or they're looking at a specific tumor and you need a specific genotype. My first question is there a pre-screening study? Is there a pre-screening aspect? Because the most expensive part of these trials is always the manufacturing of these cells. If you have a high screen fail rate or you have a screen fail rate that happens after manufacturing, it could be really costly to a client or to a sponsor and ultimately lead to delays. So, one suggestion or one project that I specifically was associated to, we looked at potentially a registry where we would be genotyping all the particular TCRs, things of that nature. But what we wound up going with was a screening study. And essentially the screening study would profile the genetic types of those particular patients. We were able to put them in specific buckets. And then specifically, if it fit the particular therapy, they were brought into the main study. And it lowered the overall screen fail rates by, I think, like 30%. But that 30% could be $1 million plus by the end of that 3x3 phase 1 trial. So those are the things you really want to talk to with clients at the beginning stages when you're in some of these solid tumor spaces.
That's an excellent point, because when we're talking about cell and gene therapy, there are some unique complexities that you don't have with, say, a traditional drug development. You don't have when you're developing a chemical compound. We're using live cells, and that is a whole nother level of planning that has to be incorporated. Are there a few other things that you help clients to think about as you're operationalizing this?
Sure. So the other thing that it's an FDA mandate, but in cell and gene therapy, there are a couple FDA guidelines or mandates that have to take place in regards to follow-up. And it's not a traditional long-term follow-up. Recently, I put a blog together about how we want to enhance the retention and long-term follow-up programs for these particular studies. So to kind of take a small step back, when you're in a CAR T program, the follow-up period is approximately 15 years post-treatment for a patient. 15 years is a long time. I think 15 years ago, I was trying to figure out what I was doing for New Year's, not worried about all the different kids' activities that I got going on right now. So, it's perspective, right? So, when you set up a long-term follow-up program, the first kind of question you have, and here's the other part about this, you're having the conversation so much earlier than you would in a traditional kind of cardiovascular, where there's a new investigational product. You have to have the long-term follow-up conversation at the same time you're having the FDA conversation for your IND. And the reason being is because there are some strategies that you could use early on when you're talking about your overall portfolio. So for instance, if you're following a subject for 15 years and in your pipeline, you have another therapy that's using the same modality, the same molecule, you're able to then put both studies into basically a funnel into your long-term follow-up. So that's cost effective for a client. And I think a company that really worked on this was either Novartis, I think was the first one that kind of put this together, and Kite. I think those were the two that, they kind of took all their solid tumor oncology or their lymphoma, and then they moved it into one long-term follow-up. So the subjects were being followed for 15 years in one protocol. Because if you did it the other way, and each protocol had 15 years follow-up because you're not into a basket, you can imagine the costs or the complexity of following all the subjects for what relatively is survival state mandated by the FDA.
Wow. And, it's overwhelming to think about just keeping track of people over 15 years. How many moves do people go through in 15 years? And then health status changes. And so what you just shared is that by pulling back and looking at that larger picture, not just what is this modality that we are working on trying to test and perhaps get approval right now, but what else do we have and how can we integrate these things to make the most efficient use of our time and our resources? That is huge, Desmond.
Oh, absolutely. And so it's a great thing to kind of think about is the overall burden, right? So I think you hit it on a point. How many cell phones do you think you have in those 15 years?
Oh my gosh, like at least 4.
Yeah, at least 4, right? And if you're like me, I'm one of those little nerds who I'm updating my iPhone every year just because I'm like, I just have to have the new iPhone. Now, granted, my son gets my old iPhone every 3rd year, so it does kind of work out. But you're right, 4 times you're doing that phone. So I think you're familiar with, and a lot of the industry is really trying to figure it out, is decentralized trials, decentralized management. What does it really mean? So when you're looking at a study that's 15 years, you have subjects that you want to lessen their burden. Now they've gone through this huge ordeal of cancer. They've gotten this cutting edge therapy, and their treatment could be sometimes one day. So what might have been over several months of radiation chemotherapy is now basically an infusion on the overnight. And then they watch you on some follow-up. There's some real critical stages post infusions, CRS specifically. And after that, which is a spike in fever to probably like 104, and then there's a lot of different SAEs that are associated with that. So it's really critical to follow a subject immediately after an infusion. But as you kind of space out from that and walking away, those months of follow-ups or years of follow-ups but need to be assessed. You want to keep the subject engaged, because what's important is, one, we want to understand the remission, if there's any, if we continue to stay in remission, but also, which you can get that information from their primary, but also you want to make sure that they stay in contact with you from a survival status. And you use technology for that, but you don't want to overburden them with a technology that, they have their cell phone changed. I need to worry about the new apps, or do they reload, things like that. So there's companies out there, Thread Research, for instance, they really work to ease that burden for subjects. And in turn, it eases the burden for the sites, because the sites aren't bringing these subjects in, every 4 months for 15 years. We're doing it from home. We're doing it from the app. So, the whole ECOA standpoint and patient reported events and things of that nature, I think that's where the DCT element is going to help these long-term follow-up studies that are mandated by the FDA. And when you explain that to clients, you give them some perspective. You can't offset technology for cost. I think that's not the exercise. But what you do is you want to increase your retention rates, because ultimately over 15 years, I think the standard, I don't know the exact percentage, but loss to follow-up is about 70% on follow-up studies. So you're losing probably about 70% over the case of 10 years or so, depending on your indication. So it can be very dramatically. But what you ultimately want to do is have high retention. And in order to have that, you complement a strong protocol, strong assessments with some levels of technology, and you move that forward.
And you need to make it easy for the patients to continue to be involved in that, because I hadn't thought of that perspective before. But from a patient standpoint, if I do this treatment and best case scenario, my cancer improves or goes away, I kind of just want to get on with my life. I don't want to have to be returning and thinking about this all the time.
Absolutely. And that's exactly it. So what I really, I had recently attended OCT in New England, and it was a conference, and I was giving a presentation on long-term follow-up and how technology can really help that. And I really truly believe that technology can be your friend in these instances and really help companies and ultimately help patients get the information for future patients. And that's really what we're trying to achieve.
As we wrap this up today, what advice do you have for companies who have a promising cell and gene therapy, and they may be stuck at a point, they're not sure what to do next? What advice or words of encouragement do you have for them?
It's always funny when you say advice, like a million things run through your mind, and you want to be consistent of like, what are some core elements? So my first thing that I would probably offer them is to understand what your limitations are right now. And by identifying your limitations, you could also identify solutions. And what I mean by that is, if you have limitations in the CMC aspect or the supply chain, which, for some of these therapies can be pretty complex and pretty comprehensive, be sure to reach out to companies like Allucent and partners of that nature, where you can get some trusted advice and trusted reference material to help you through those smaller aspects of it. So I would say, from a supply chain standpoint, you want to be sure that you have the right approach to your logistics. I think the other thing is talent acquisition. You want to be sure that you're bringing in the right people, either within your company or you're partnering with the right level outside of your company.
It is so easy to get stuck on the limitations and to keep looking internally for solutions, and you can get stuck spinning your wheels for a long time. What I hear you saying is that sometimes it's best to just say, okay, this is the issue. Who can help us?
Exactly. And that's what it's about. I believe in that the community of the industry can help the patients. I know there's a business side to clinical trials. We all understand that. We all can agree that is ultimately part of the goal. But the altruistic, or the why all of us do what we do, is more the altruistic, is that we want to cure diseases. We want to help patients. And I think ultimately, having those conversations early, looking at your clinical development from your pre-IND through your long-term follow-up is good to start early too. That's another point of advice. I think having those questions outlined in the beginning are helpful to your overall strategy and the next 15 years of development.
As we have discussed, cell and gene therapy have the potential to revolutionize medical treatment. But getting those innovative products to patients who need them requires careful attention to both emerging science and ever-evolving regulatory guidance. Having expert guidance can help small and mid-sized companies navigate this process efficiently and get products to the patients who desperately need assistance and solutions. Desmond, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our listeners.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate the time today. I really do look forward to how the industry and the landscape is going to change in the future. And it was great to spend some time with you today.
Thank you for all of our listeners. Over the last 3 episodes, we have discussed thinking big for small and mid-sized biotechs. And I encourage each of you to think big and make a difference. For more information, you can go to allucent.com.